Prologue. First late fire moon. September, 2:15 p.m. Looking up, he saw the dark clouds, which had covered the sky since early morning, begin spitting a light rain as if unable to resist the urge any longer. The captain of the Royal Select, Gazif Stronov, clicked his tongue at the hazy world before him. A little earlier, and he would have been able to reach home without getting soaked. He peered out across the sky, but couldn't see any breaks in the dark clouds that completely enveloped Riestes, the royal capital sharing a name with the wider Riestes kingdom. Even if he waited, it didn't seem like the rain would stop. Abandoning the idea of lingering inside the castle, he pulled his cloak's hood up over his head and stepped into the rain. The guards at the gate knew him, and he passed freely onto the city's main street. Normally, this street would have been full of activity, but now there were hardly any people to be seen. Only a few were out, picking their paths carefully so as not to slip and fall on the road that looked almost black. It was so drenched. From the lack of crowds, he figured the rain must have started some time ago.
Then maybe it wouldn't have mattered if I had left earlier.
As his cloak grew gradually heavier in the shower, he walked in silence, passing by a few people similarly outfitted with rain gear. His cloak was serving as a rain jacket for now, but when wet, the way it clung to his skin was uncomfortable. Gazif picked up his pace to hurry home. He was nearing his house and sighed with relief, knowing he would soon be free of his sopping wet cloak, when suddenly his attention was almost magnetically drawn down an alley off to the right where, in this thinly veiled world, a shabby-looking man sat letting the drizzle soak him as it pleased. The wet hair plastered to the man's forehead, dripping raindrops, was a different color at the roots. Perhaps it was a half-hearted dye job? Since the man was looking down, Gazif couldn't make out his face. The reason Gazif's eyes had stopped on him was not because he wondered why the man had no weather-appropriate clothing and was steadily becoming drenched. Instead, he had the feeling something was off about the stranger. Something inconsistent. The man's right hand in particular caught his attention. The weapon gripped there, tightly, like the way a child holds their mother's hand, didn't match the grimy man at all. It was an extremely rare weapon. A katana, made in a city that was said to lie far to the south in a desert.
Did he steal it? No, I don't get that feeling from him. He seems familiar somehow.
Gazif felt a bizarre sensation, like he'd buttoned his shirt one hole off. The moment Gazif halted and saw the man's profile, memories came flooding back to him.
Could it be Unglaus?
The minute he'd said that, the thought, not a chance, flashed across his mind. Ainz Ooal was the man he'd once fought in the final match of the royal tournament. The image of the man he'd had such a close battle with was seared into his brain. He couldn't forget the face of the strongest warrior he dueled with since picking up a sword, the one he still considered a rival, even if the feeling was one-sided. Yes, the man's hollowed cheeks resembled his rival's face. But it couldn't be him. Certainly, his appearance was similar. Despite the changes that accompanied time's passage, his features were clearly recognizable. But the man Gazif remembered would never wear such a pathetic expression. He had been a man overflowing with confidence in his sword and enveloped in an intense, burning will to fight. He wasn't an old, wet dog like this. Gazif approached the man, footsteps splashing. Reacting to the noise, the man sluggishly raised his head. Gazif gasped. Seeing the man's face head-on confirmed it. He was Ainz Ooal, the brilliant swordsman. But he had none of his former radiance. The brain who Gazif looked upon now had been completely broken, like a beaten animal. Ainz staggered to his feet, his slow, Or perhaps listless movements were not those of a warrior, nor even an old soldier. He dropped his eyes and turned around without saying a word. Then he set off, dejectedly walking away. As that back receded into the rain, Gassif had the feeling if they parted like this, they would never meet again. So he closed the distance and shouted,
Unglaus! Brain Unglaus!
If the man said he was wrong, Gassif would tell himself it was a coincidental resemblance. But the very quiet voice that reached his ears did not contradict him.
Stronov?
There was no soul in that voice. Gassif never would have thought it was the same brain he had clashed swords with.
What? What happened to you?
He asked in shock.
What in the world could have happened to him?
It's possible for anyone to ruin themselves. Gassif had known a few who had done it. When people were always seeking out easier ways to live, one failure could cause them to lose everything. But he couldn't imagine that genius swordsman, Brain Unglaus, having anything to do with those people. Was it because he didn't want to acknowledge that his greatest opponent ever had fallen so far? Their eyes met.
What a face.
Brain's cheeks were hollow, and there were dark patches under his eyes. The eyes themselves contained no energy, and his skin was pale. He looked almost like a corpse.
No, a dead person would look better. Unglaus is dead on his feet. Stronov, it's broken. What?
The first thing Gassif glanced to when he heard those words was the katana in Brain's hand. But he realized that wasn't what the other man meant. It wasn't the sword that was broken. But,
tell me, are we strong?
Gassif couldn't answer in the affirmative. What came to Gassif's mind was the incident at Karn. If the mysterious caster, Ainz Ooal Gown, hadn't come to his rescue, he and all his men would have died. That had been the extent of his strength, even if he was said to be the strongest in the kingdom. There was no way he could puff out his chest and say he was strong. How did Brain interpret that silence? He replied,
Weak! We're weak. In the end, we're only human. Our skills with swords are garbage. Humans. We belong to an inferior race.
It was true that humans were feeble. The gap in physical strength between humans and dragons, the most powerful race, was obvious. Dragons had tough scales, sharp claws, wings that carried them into the sky, and breath that could annihilate anything, whereas humans had nothing comparable. That was precisely why warriors aspired to slay dragons. There was honor in overcoming that overwhelming gap with cultivated ability, comrades, and gear. It was a feat reserved for those so strong they could be called ultra-warriors. So, had Brain failed to kill a dragon? Had he aimed too high to reach and thus lost his balance and fallen?
I don't know. Doesn't every warrior know that? That humans are weak?
No, he didn't understand why this was suddenly so upsetting to Brain. Everyone knew there were heights that couldn't be scaled. People sang his praises, calling him the strongest warrior, but Gassif himself wondered if he really deserved the title. For one thing, there was a good chance that Theocracy was hiding warriors stronger than him. Also, subhumans like ogres and giants had higher base physical strength than the human Gassif. If they acquired the same level of ability he had, or even a little lower, he probably wouldn't be able to win. The pinnacle was simply beyond sight. Gassif knew full well it still existed. Had Brain not understood something so basic, something that any warrior should know?
There are heights to aspire to. That's why we train ourselves to win. Right? Believing you'll get there someday.
But Brain shook his head emphatically. His soaking wet hair flung drops of water everywhere.
No, I don't mean that level!
He cried in a pained voice. Gassif saw the man before him superimposed on his memory. Gazif felt the soul of Brain's attacks had been present in that shout, even if the declaration itself was antithetical.
Stronov! The true peaks can't be reached even with hard work. Humans can't touch them. That's the true nature of peaks. In the end, we're nothing more than children with sticks. It's a continuation of the night games we used to play as kids.
He turned to Gazif quietly, with an emotionless face.
Hey, Stronov. You have confidence in your sword too, right? But that thing is garbage. You only take up that junk and feel like you're protecting people. You saw something that beyond our grasp. I did. I learned. There's a peak that humans will never scale. No.
Brain practically laughed at himself.
What I saw wasn't even so high. I wasn't even capable of seeing the true summits. It was a game. Actually, it's a funny story. So if you train to be able to glimpse that peak...
Brain's face twisted up with rage.
You don't understand anything! No human could ever even approach that monster's ability! You can swing your sword infinite times, but you'll never reach it! What a joke. What was I even aiming for?
Gazif couldn't respond. He'd seen people with wounded psyches like this before. People whose friends had died before their very eyes and had their spirits simply broken. There was no way to save them. It couldn't come from outside. No matter how many people tried to help, if the fallen couldn't gather the resolve to stand up again, it was futile.
Unglaus. Stronov. The power you can obtain with a sword is meaningless. In the face of true dominance, it's trash.
No. There was nothing of his former bravery now.
I'm glad I was able to meet you at the end.
Gazif watched with sorrowful eyes as Brain turned to go. He couldn't summon the energy to call after the receding, pitiful, worn-out figure who had once been his great rival. But Gazif couldn't miss the few brief words that Brain uttered as he left.
Now, I can die. Wait! Wait! Brain Unglaus!
He cried out after him with burning emotion. He strode forward, grabbed the retreating man by the shoulders, and yanked. There was none of the former brilliance in that stumbling figure. But though Gazif had pulled him using all his strength, though Brain's stance broke, Brain didn't fall, because his body was well trained, and he possessed a supreme sense of balance. Gazif felt a little relieved, recognizing that his one-time opponent hadn't gone weak. It wasn't too late. He couldn't let him die now.
What are you doing? We're going to my house. Stop it. Don't try to save me. I want to die. I'm tired of being scared. No more jumping at shadows, thinking someone's creeping up behind me. I don't want to face reality anymore. I don't want to think how happy I was wielding a piece of crap.
Listening to Brain's practically pleading voice irritated Gazif.
Shut up and follow me.
Although he'd instructed Brain to follow, Gazif seized Brain's arm before walking off. The way Brain stumbled along without any resistance disgusted Gazif in a way he couldn't put into words.
You're going to get changed, eat, and go straight to bed.
26 Midfire Moon, August, 1:45 p.m. Riestes Kingdom's royal capital, the city of Riestes. The old city was the best way to describe the capital that 9 million people called home. Not only in the sense that it had history, but in other ways as well. The days plodding along, the depressing backwardness, the lack of change. A mere stroll down its streets was enough to understand. Many of the houses lining the streets were old and roughly made, completely lacking in dynamism and brilliance. But different people saw this in different ways. Yes, there were probably some people who saw the city as traditional and calm, while others found it boring and internally stagnant. It seemed like the capital would continue to be as it always had, without change, even though nothing stays the same forever. The royal capital had many unpaved roads, so as soon as it rained, the paths became muddy. The sight made it hard to believe this was inside the city. The kingdom wasn't necessarily underdeveloped, though. It was an error to compare it to the empire or theocracy in the first place. Since the roads weren't very wide, and no one walked straight down the middle in front of the carriages, pedestrians bunched up along the side of the lanes, making for the picture of squalor. The residents were used to it, so they weaved their way through. They approached one another head-on and deftly dodged at the last second. The road Sebas was walking down, however, differed from most places in the capital. It was a broad street, nicely paved with cobblestones. From a glance to either side, it was easy to see why. The houses lining the street were large and splendid. One could practically smell the affluence. That was because this lively promenade was the capital's main boulevard. As Sebas walked in his dignified manner, most of the women in the street turned to watch him, charmed by the refinement of his middle-aged face. Some even stared directly at him with obvious passion. But Sebas paid them no mind, only keeping his posture erect and his head forward as he strode on without a single step out of rhythm. He wouldn't stop until he reached his destination. At least that was the impression his gait gave. But then he suddenly halted, and after looking both ways for carriage traffic, he turned at a right angle to cut across the street. He headed toward an old woman. She'd set down a frame pack piled high with baggage and was rubbing her ankle beside it.
What seems to be the matter?
Perhaps surprised by the sudden question, the old woman had eyes filled with suspicion when she raised her head. The moment she saw Sebas's good looks and fine clothes, however, her expression softened.
You seem to be having some trouble. May I help you?
No, there's nothing I would trouble you with, sir.
When Sebas grinned, the old woman's cheeks reddened. This charming gentleman's wonderful smile broke through her remaining defenses in an instant. She'd finished business at her stall for the day and was on her way home when she twisted an ankle, which was now giving her a hard time. The main avenue wasn't dangerous, but that didn't mean everyone present was a good citizen. If she asked the wrong person for help, it was possible they'd steal all her goods and profits. She knew things like that actually happened, so she was hesitant to seek help indiscriminately. So, this was a simple matter.
I shall accompany you. Would you show me the way?
Are you sure, sir?
Of course. It's only natural to help someone in trouble.
The woman thanked him repeatedly, and he turned his back to her.
Now please, get on.
I could never.
She sounded embarrassed.
My grimy clothes will soil your fine garments.
But Sebas smiled kindly. What did dirty clothes matter? Such things need to be taken into account when helping someone in trouble. Suddenly, the faces of his colleagues from the great tomb of Nasri came to mind. Dubious looks, furrowed brows, and even open contempt. But no matter the feelings of Demiurge, who would probably be the first to react in such a fashion, Sebas believed this was the correct thing to do. It was right to help someone. She protested several times, but Sebas finally convinced her to climb aboard. Then, he hoisted up her pack with one hand. The old woman and everyone else who saw him steadily carrying that apparently very heavy luggage sighed in admiration. He set off according to his passengers' directions. Chapter 1. A Boy's Feelings. 1. Second late fire moon, September, 11:30 p.m. The man lit the lantern at his hip. He used a special type of oil, creating a blazing green that bathed the area in an eerie light. When he stepped outside, he felt a rush of heat. He made a face, but there was nothing he could do about the season. This time of year, every place in the kingdom was sweltering, even after the sun set. The year's hottest days were over, so it was supposed to be getting gradually colder, but there was no sign of that yet.
It's hot again tonight. Sure is. I heard, though, that if you go up north or near the sea, it's a little cooler.
The man's partner for the night responded to his griping.
If it would rain, at least things would cool off a bit.
He gazed up as he spoke, but counter to his hopes, the clear sky contained not a single cloud. It was the usual night spreading out above them, its stars appearing strangely large.
Yeah, rain would be great. Well, shall we get to work?
It wouldn't be quite right to call these two men typical villagers. First, there was their gear. With long swords at their waists and leather armor, they were far too well equipped to be the community watch group. Plus, the men's builds and faces didn't fit people who worked the fields. They seemed accustomed to violence. The men walked without saying a word. Nothing could be heard besides their footfalls in the quiet village enveloped by the night's darkness. It felt eerily like everything had gone extinct, but the men moved on unfazed. Their calm was proof that they'd done this many times. The village they marched through was completely encompassed by a high wall, and there were 6 watchtowers visible from their current vantage point alone. The towers were sturdily constructed, even better than those in regions where monsters frequently appeared. More than a settlement, this was a strategic point. But still, if a third party saw it, they might assume it was a normal village with stricter security than most. That said, what came next would probably provoke some confusion. The sight was that strange. Normally, wall-surrounded residences and storehouses, while fields spread out beyond. Cultivating fields inside the village meant that an extensive wall had to be built around arable land, which took too much time and labor. But in this village, they'd enclosed the green plants waving in the breeze, as if they were protecting gold. The men walking through this weird village felt someone's gaze following them from one of the watchtowers. They had friends armed with bows and arrows there. If something happened, they could wave their lanterns overhead to call for assistance. Considering the archery skills of their comrades, the two felt it would be best to refrain from requesting support fire. But it was incredibly reassuring to know that everyone would get up if the tower bell rang. If the patrolling men waved their lanterns due to a misunderstanding, all their sleeping colleagues would be angry. But if there were signs of anything strange, they planned to call for backup right away. The pair didn't want to die. Not that they thought anything would happen. They'd been doing the same thing over and over for months, and they would probably go on doing it. Even though they'd lost interest in what would come next, they walked through the village along the specified route. Right as they reached the halfway point of their patrol, something slipped over the man's mouth like a snake. No, snake wasn't right. It had attached to his mouth and would never come off. It was more like an octopus's tentacle. Next, his jaw was yanked up, and a searing pain tore across his exposed neck. This all took less than a second. A sound like something drinking reached from his neck, and that was the last thing this man heard in his life. The hand over the man's mouth let go and moved to support him from behind so he wouldn't crumple to the ground. After confirming that the magic weapon, Vampire Blade, had drunk all the blood, another hand extracted it from the man's throat. The figure propping up the man was dressed all in black. Every part except the eyes was covered with pitch-black cloth. The outfit itself may have been cloth, but atop it, the wearer wore vambraces and greaves to improve defense. There was also a metal plate worn over the chest, which had a distinctly female contour to it. Another figure, similarly dressed all in black and with a similarly contoured breastplate, stood behind the other man. The first woman looked her way and moved her head in a single slight nod. She took note of their stealth kills and scanned the area. It didn't seem like anyone had noticed. In a corner of her mind, she was relieved. The lanterns still gave off light, but the women stuck close to them, so the ones in the watchtower probably couldn't tell what had happened. The only thing she'd been worried about was the possibility of detection in the moment they attacked, when they used darkness crossing to teleport the short distances between shadows. But that fear was past now. Still holding her dagger, redder after draining her victim's blood, she supported the corpse so he didn't fall. To the guards in the watchtower, it must have looked as if the men patrolling had stopped, so if the bodies remained standing still for too long or crumpled to the ground, it would arouse suspicion. That's why they needed to move immediately onto the next step, but that wasn't her job. Suddenly, her hand sensed the vibration of something like a pillar running through the man's body. The corpse jerked into motion a second later, proving it was not her imagination. She wasn't surprised the man was moving despite being dead. It was all according to plan. She let go and used a skill at the same time. It was one of her ninja skills, Shadow Dive. The ability allowed her to completely melt into the surroundings anywhere there was shadow, rendering her impossible to discover with normal eyesight. Leaving behind the two who had vanished into the darkness, the pair of corpses advanced as if their chains had come off, along the original route they were supposed to follow. It was as if they just remembered what their jobs were. The only difference was their movements had become slow and heavy. The reason no blood spurted from their necks, even though their wounds hadn't healed, was simply that there wasn't any left. There was only one reason they would be moving in such a state. They'd been made into zombies and were moving according to their master's orders. It wasn't the two women who had turned them. A casual glance would reveal only the two men they expected, and even if an observer could glimpse the women's murky forms, there would still be only 4 people. But there was a 5th. It was this person who had created the zombies. The women couldn't see the 5th either, but a ninjutsu technique they had mastered allowed them to perceive beings hidden by magic or skills, so they could detect a presence directly in front of them.
Preparation here is complete.
Perfect, they responded in low voices. A similarly quiet voice replied,
Yeah, I know. I was watching. I'm moving to the next location. We have to catch the high-ranking guys if we can.
This was also a woman's voice, but it was higher-pitched and had an air of immaturity, like a child's.
I'm also going on to the next raid. Where are the other 2? Probably off screwing around, since they don't have anything to do. I don't think so. They're hiding out near the village, ready to simultaneously attack the front and rear in case of an emergency. All right. I'm going to go to the highest priority location. You guys should also proceed according to plan.
Their invisible comrade, whom they could sense only by her presence, floated lightly up into the sky. She was using fly to travel through the air. The receding presence moved toward the building she had called the highest priority location. It was one of the buildings in this village and had a critical foothold they needed to capture first. Normally, they would want to prioritize other buildings, but the reason that one was designated as the most urgent was due to the magic spell Message. Many people avoided conveying information via message because it was often unreliable and difficult to confirm the authenticity of dispatches. At the same time, some used the spell without worrying about the shortcomings, such as the Empire, where magical education was promoted on a national level. There were also several major merchant networks that prioritized gathering information as fast as possible, and the enemies who controlled this village were much the same. So first, it was necessary to capture the communications person in that building. Now that their comrade had departed, the pair needed to quickly hide out in the vicinity of their objective. It was important to execute everything at the same time and complete the raid before anyone realized it was happening. With sharp exhalations, the 2 ninjas set off running. No normal person would notice them, moving like they were, from shadow to shadow. Even high-level adventurers would have had a hard time discovering intruders equipped with their magic items. In other words, no one in this village could see them. Her companion, running parallel to her, dexterously moved her fingers. All she did was bend her digits in various ways, but the meaning had been clear.
Good thing they didn't have a dog.
She answered with her fingers.
Agreed.
It was the sign language of assassins. When one was as proficient as they were, it was possible to convey information just as fast as talking. They taught it to their comrades, but unfortunately, they could use it for only simple signs and instructions. These two, however, had speed and vocabulary suitable for daily conversation, so they used it for clandestine small talk like this often.
No doubt about it. It's so much easier when they don't come gather around the scent of blood.
If the men had had a dog, things wouldn't have gone this smoothly. They'd prepared a way to render an animal powerless, but there was nothing better than not having to deal with more problems. After her reply, her comrade's fingers moved speedily.
Then I'll head to my target building according to plan.
When she replied with a "got it," the comrade running next to her gradually veered away. Left alone, she glanced sidelong at the fields while she sprinted. What was being cultivated there was neither wheat nor some other grain, nor was it vegetables. The plant was used as raw material in the manufacture of the most rampant illegal drug in the kingdom, black flour. There were several fields inside this walled village, but they were all growing the same thing. That proved that this village was a narcotics production base. Black flour, also sometimes called lila powder, was a black powdered drug taken by drinking it in solution. It was mass-produced and cheap, as well as a simple, effective route to intoxicated euphoria, so it was the most well-known narcotic in the kingdom. Moreover, while the drug was addictive, there were supposedly no side effects, so it was in widespread use. Thinking on the information about the drug they had, she snorted. There was no such thing as a drug with no side effects. The "I can quit it whenever I want" misunderstanding was also ridiculous. She'd perform autopsies on dead black flour addicts, and all their brains had shrunk to about 4/5 their original size. In the first place, black flour produced from wild plants was a powerful poison. Where did anyone get off believing a plant that toxic wasn't also addictive? Street-ready black flour could be categorized as a narcotic, but only because it was not very potent. Even so, it was extremely addictive and remained in the body for a long time. Most users wound up taking another dose before the first one had completely left their system. Unless they went to a priest to have the substance forcibly removed via magic, it was virtually impossible for people who reached a certain degree of addiction to completely quit of their own free will. The most problematic thing about this horrible drug was that the symptoms of withdrawal from it was not pronounced, and even if people had a bad trip, they didn't go on a rampage or hurt anyone around them. Consequently, the kingdom authorities failed to understand the threat and spent all their efforts exposing the evils of other drugs, practically giving people tacit permission to use black flour. She knew the empire even claimed that the kingdom was secretly supporting the industry. For her part, when she had been an assassin, she had occasionally used drugs, and her organization had grown them, so she wasn't against them. Narcotics could in fact have wonderful effects when used properly. They were basically medicinal herbs with a dangerous element. But this time, she was out on a job, so her personal opinion didn't enter into it. However,
requests that don't come through the Adventurers Guild are dangerous.
She wasn't really convinced the job was the best idea either. She frowned under her face covering. The client was a friend of her team's leader. They were being paid a fair amount, but there were all sorts of issues that could crop up from taking a job without going through the guild, even if they were one of the only 2 adamantite adventurer teams in the kingdom.
Wait. There are 3 now, I think.
As she remembered that she had recently heard news of a new adamantite team, she arrived at the building they had codenamed Number 2. Her role was to gather all the intelligence she could find inside. When that was done, she had to set fire to the fields. The smoke from the burning narcotic plants would be poisonous, but if she didn't do it, she couldn't complete her mission. Depending on the direction of the wind, some villagers might be harmed, but there was no time or means to have them evacuate.
The necessary sacrifices.
She told herself this, and hurled her concern for the villagers' safety into oblivion. Raised as an assassin, she was rarely moved by a loss of life, particularly if it was someone she didn't even know. Then no matter what happened to them, she wouldn't so much as twitch an eyebrow. The only thing she considered was how she hated the look on her leader's face whenever there was innocent victims. But for this operation, they had their leader's approval, so she didn't feel even the slightest inclination to try saving anyone. More importantly, after this raid was over, she would teleport straight to another village and burn down the fields in exactly the same way. The plan fully occupied her head. This wasn't the only village where they produced the base for the drug. According to their research, there were 10 places in the kingdom where large-scale growing operations were located. And there were probably still others they hadn't discovered. Otherwise, it would have been impossible for these groups to yield the estimated amount necessary for the drug to spread all over the kingdom like it had.
We have to pick the weeds where they grow. It might be in vain, but it's all we can do.
If there were written orders from the organization in this village, that would be excellent. But she didn't expect things to go so smoothly. The most they could hope for was that the village's overseer would have some information.
Our leader would be happy if I could unearth at least part of the org. Though,
the huge crime syndicate manufacturing the narcotic was called the 8 Fingers. Their name derived from a deity subordinate to the god of earth, the god of theft, who had 8 fingers. It was a massive organization that dominated the kingdom's underworld. The outfit was split into 8 divisions: slave trafficking, assassination, smuggling, thievery, drug dealing, security, money lending, and gambling. It was said that they were behind every underworld crew in the kingdom, and because the group was so large, the full truth about it was shrouded in mystery. However, there was one thing that proved how far the 8 Fingers had reached into the kingdom, and that was the village before her eyes. They were growing illegal drugs right out in the open. This fact proved to her that the noble holding power in this land was an accomplice. But even if she exposed the crime, she would be unable to accuse the lord or lady. If the royal family made an inquiry, or the judicial officials became involved, that would be a different story. But they would still encounter difficulties in pinning the crime on a landed aristocrat. This fiefdom's ruler would probably claim, "I had no knowledge this was being used to make a narcotic," or say, "The villagers did it on their own," to shift blame. Charging nobility directly wasn't very effective, and even if efforts were made in an attempt to suppress circulation, the 8 Fingers had seduced several nobles who were now involved in the distribution routes. The situation had become impossible to resolve using guards and other regular means. That's why they were currently relying on the violent last resort of burning the fields. It was the only option left. Honestly, she didn't think burning the fields would work to address even the symptom. That was how far the syndicate had undermined the kingdom. It was too powerful, and it had reached its tentacles into the government.
We're merely buying time. If we can't strike a target where we can turn the tables with one blow, then this, too, will all be in vain. 2. It was raining. The sound was so intense it grated on the ears. The kingdom's roads weren't built with drainage in mind, especially when it came to the back streets. As a result, the alleys transformed into huge lakes. The rain beating down on the surface of the water sent up little splashes. The wind whipped up the spray and filled the air with its scent. It felt as if the royal capital itself had sunk into a body of water. In this world, colored gray by whirling droplets, there was a boy. He lived in a shack. No,
It could not even be called a shack. The main beams holding it up were about as thin as an adult man's arms. Instead of a solid roof, rags draped over the shelter to cover it, and the walls were no more than the ceiling cloths sloppily hanging down. In this dwelling, which offered hardly any shelter from the elements outside, the boy of about 6 years of age lay in a thin cloth spread out on the floor, curled up like a casually tossed piece of garbage. If one stopped to think about it, the wooden beams, the scraps that formed the ceiling and walls, it seemed like the kind of thing a child could build, even just for fun. The only real benefit of this home was it kept the rain from falling directly on him. The endless deluge had drastically lowered the temperature and enveloped the boy in a shivery chill. His foggy exhalations provided but momentary evidence for his existence before they faded away as the air stole their warmth. Prior to his sheltering here, the cold rain had drenched him, and his body heat was deserting him at a terrible pace. He had no way to stop the shivering. The single minuscule silver lining of this miserable situation was probably that the permeating chill felt good to his bruised and beaten body. Still lying on his side, the boy looked out at the world. At the alley, no one walked down anymore. The only sounds he could hear were the rainfall and his own breathing. The scene gave him the impression there was no one else in the world. That was the extent of the calm. Although he was young, he understood that he would likely die. Not old enough to fully understand what death entailed, the boy wasn't very afraid. That, and it didn't seem that life was worth holding dear. The only reason he'd managed to hang on so far was a sentiment similar to the desire to avoid pain. If death would come without pain, only cold, like how he felt at that very moment, then dying didn't seem so bad. He gradually lost feeling in his wet body, and his consciousness clouded. It would have been better to move somewhere the wind and rain wouldn't come in before the weather turned, but he'd run into some nasty men and received a beating, so getting back here had been all he could manage. There was one tiny, happy thing. Did that mean everything else was sad? The fact that he hadn't eaten in 2 days was normal, so that wasn't sad. His parents were absent, and no one else would care for him. This had been the case for a long time, so it wasn't something to be upset about. That he was dressed in rags and smelled bad was only natural. Eating rotten food and drinking dirty water to fill his belly was all he'd ever known. Following this train of thought, was it sad the abandoned house where he had been living had been stolen from him? The hut he'd worked hard to build had been trashed for someone's amusement, and drunk men had beaten him, leaving injuries all over his body. No. The heartbreaking truth was that the boy couldn't even understand what was sad, or why. But this was the end. The sorrow he didn't even understand would end here. The grave called for the lucky and the unlucky alike. Yes, death was absolute. He closed his eyes. Keeping them open was far too much effort for a body that had ceased to feel even the cold. He could hear his tiny, frail heartbeat in the darkness. In a world where only that and the rain could be heard, another strange sound appeared. It was like something blocking the rain. Despite his fading consciousness, he mustered the curiosity peculiar to children and urged his eyelids to move. In the thin strip of his field of vision, he saw it. The boy's nearly closed eyes popped wide open. Something beautiful. For a moment, he couldn't understand. Perhaps like a jewel or like a nugget of gold were the right descriptors. But to someone who'd been abandoned, who'd lived eating half-rotten food, those words didn't come to mind. No. He thought one thing. Like the sun. That was the most beautiful thing he knew, the most out of reach.
The world dyed gray by the rain. Dark rain clouds raining in the sky. Was that why? Is the sun here with me because it went on a trip when no one could see it? He wondered to himself. It reached out its hand and caressed his face. And then, the boy hadn't been a person. There had never been anyone who saw him as a person. But that day, he became one. Third late fire moon. September, 4:15 a.m. The Riestes Kingdom at the royal capital. At the innermost part of the city sat Rolente Castle, which occupied an enormous space. The curtain wall around it, almost a mile long, was furnished with 12 giant cylindrical towers that formed the defense network. The room was in one of those 12 towers. In the not-so-large unlit space, there was a single bed. Lying on it was a child whose age fell right at the vague border between boy and young man. His blonde hair was cropped short, and his skin glowed with a healthy tan. Climb. Though that was the only name he had claim to, he was a soldier attending a woman often titled Golden, permitted closer to her than any other, a position many looked upon with envy. He woke up early, rising before the sun. By the time he noticed his consciousness returning from the deep dark world of sleep, his mind was clear, and his body was primed for the most part. One of the things he had pride in was how he could fall asleep and wake up with ease. Climb's almond-shaped eyes, with the whites visible below the iris, opened wide and revealed his iron will shining within. Pushing back the rather heavy blanket covering his body, even in summer, nights surrounded by stone were chilly, he sat up. He touched his face near his eyes. The fingers came away, soaking wet. That dream again. Climb wiped the tears off his face with his sleeves. Maybe the heavy rain from 2 days ago had reminded him of his childhood. They weren't grieving tears. How many people did one meet in life whom they could respect? Was everyone lucky enough to serve a person for whom they would give their life without hesitation? That day, Climb had met a woman whom he firmly believed he could die for without a bit of regret. What he had wiped away were tears of joy. He had cried out of gratitude for the miracle that began with that meeting. With determination on his face, still appropriately childish for his age, Climb stood up. In this dark world bereft of even a single light, Climb whispered in a voice hoarse from too much straining. "Shine!" In response to Climb's key word, a white light appeared in a lamp suspended from the ceiling, illuminating the room. It was a magic item imbued with continual light. Although this type of item was commonly available, it was still expensive. The reason he had one wasn't entirely due to his special position. It was unsafe to burn something, even for lighting in a place like a stone tower where air did not circulate very well. For that reason, despite the significant initial cost, almost all the rooms were equipped with a magic light. The floor and walls illuminated by the white light were hewn from rock. A thin rug provided as much protection as it could against the cold hardness of the floor. The other things in the room were a coarsely made wooden bed, a wardrobe that seemed large enough to hold armor, a desk with a drawer, and a wooden chair covered by a thin cushion. Perhaps it seemed shabby to an outsider, but for someone of Climb's rank, it was undeserved luxury. Soldiers didn't get private quarters, usually bedding down together in large rooms with shared bunks. The only other furnishing they were provided was a wooden lockbox to store personal belongings. In addition, he also had white full-plate armor enshrined in one corner of the room. Rank-and-file soldiers would never be supplied with such well-made gear so lustrous and unblemished it seemed to gleam from within. This special treatment certainly wasn't anything Climb had earned through his own actions. The gear was a token of affection from his master. It was no wonder people were jealous of him. Opening the wardrobe,
Climb removed some clothes and dressed himself using the mirror found inside. After putting on a shirt that smelled metallic from frequent use, he donned his shirt and mail over it. Normally he'd put armor above the mail, but he didn't do that now. Instead, he slipped on a vest lined with many pockets and a pair of pants to finish the outfit. In his hand, he carried a bucket with a towel in it. Lastly, he checked the mirror to make sure nothing was strange and ensure nothing about his outfit was in disarray. Any failure on his part could be used to criticize his master, the Golden Princess Renaer, so Climb took the utmost care. His purpose wasn't to cause trouble for her. He was there to give his master everything he had. He closed his eyes before the mirror and imagined her face. The Golden Princess, Renaer Thier Chardalon Ryle Vyself. She possessed such heavenly beauty she could easily be mistaken for a goddess. She radiated with a compassionate spirit befitting her noble blood and superior wisdom that gave birth to her government policies. She was a noble among nobles, a princess among princesses, the supreme woman. Climb could not allow himself to put so much as a nick in the untarnished gem that sparkled like gold. If their relationship were a ring, Renaer would be a large brilliant cut diamond, while Climb was nothing but the prongs surrounding her. Since his make was cheap, he lowered the item's overall worth, but he couldn't allow it to fall any further. Climb was unable to stop the passion from building in his chest every time he thought of her. Even a devout believer in the gods could not surpass Climb's current fervor. He gazed at himself for a short time, nodded with a satisfaction that his appearance would not bring his master shame, and left the room. 3. Third Late Fire Moon, September, 4:35 a.m. Climb headed for the large hall that occupied the tower's entire first floor as a training area. Usually, it was filled with the body heat of soldiers, but of course, no one was there this early in the morning. The empty space was so quiet he could practically hear the silence. Because the room was enclosed in stone, Climb's footsteps echoed loudly. Quasi-permanent magic lights brightly illuminated the hall. Inside were standing suits of armor fastened to posts, as well as straw figures used as archery targets. Along the walls were shelves lined with a variety of dull-bladed weapons. There was a reason a training area normally found outside had been built indoors. Valencia Palace was housed within the Rolente Castle compound. If soldiers trained in the open, it was possible for visiting messengers to see them. As this was not very dignified, several facilities were built inside the towers. It was also an option to show off the manly training soldiers as a diplomatic stratagem, but that wasn't the kingdom's style. The prevailing mindset was to present an elegant, gorgeous, and noble picture of the realm. That said, there were some exercises that required being outside. These were performed stealthily in a corner of the grounds, on an athletic field beyond the walls, or removed from the capital entirely. Climb entered the hushed room, penetrating the chilly air, and began leisurely stretching in a corner. After a thorough 30-minute stretch routine, Climb's face was more than a little flushed. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his exhaled breaths brimmed with excess heat. He put a hand to his forehead and wiped off the perspiration before approaching the weapon shelf and choosing a fairly thick, large dull iron practice sword. The hand around it was hardened from repeatedly forming and popping blisters. He tested out different swords until he found one that fit his grip perfectly. Next, he placed lumps of metal in his pockets, buttoning them to make sure the contents wouldn't fall out. With several pieces inside, the vest had taken on the same weight as a full suit of armor. In exchange for being sturdy, ordinary full-plate armor was heavy, and the limited range of movement was also a disadvantage. If one wanted to practice under conditions similar to actual combat, training in armor was ideal. But taking out a full suit of armor just to practice wasn't something Climb did very often. Besides, he couldn't wear the white mail he'd been given for training. That's why he resorted to the substitute instead. Climb tightly gripped the iron weapon larger than a greatsword. He raised it over his head and lowered it slowly as he exhaled. As its tip was about to touch the floor, he brought it up again, inhaling. Gradually increasing the speed of his practice swings, he concentrated intently, staring into space with a penetrating gaze. He did over 300 repetitions. Climb was bright red, and sweat dripped down his face. The heat building up in his body dramatically raised his breath's temperature. Climb was a fairly well-built soldier, but the weight of the oversized greatsword was still extreme. It was especially difficult slowing the sword so the tip didn't touch the ground. The amount of strength needed for this was not insignificant. After 500 repetitions, both his arms began cramping, as though screaming out to him. A waterfall cascaded down his face. Climb was aware that this was his limit. Still, he didn't seem interested in stopping. But
That's enough, don't you think?
someone else called out to him. Climb was flustered as he turned to look in the direction of the voice, and he immediately noticed a man. There was no word more fitting for him than robust. He was like steel incarnate. Because his craggy face was frowning, the ensuing mass of wrinkles made him appear older than his actual age. His bulging muscles showed he was no ordinary man. There probably wasn't a single soldier in the kingdom who didn't know this figure.
Captain Stronov!
Captain of the Royal Select, Gazov Stronov. He was the strongest warrior in the country, and it was said he had no equals in neighboring realms either.
Any more than that is too much. No point in killing yourself.
Climb lowered his sword and watched his spasming arms.
You're right. I might have pushed myself a bit too hard.
Climb expressionlessly thanked Gazov, as the older man shrugged.
If you really think so, then it'd be great if you wouldn't make me say the same thing all the time. I wonder how many times it's been.
I'm sorry.
Gazov shrugged once more at the boy's head bowed in apology. The pair had exchanged these lines many times, almost like a greeting. Usually, this was where it ended, and they would each become absorbed in their own training. But today was different.
How about it, Climb? Want to try sparring?
Climb's expressionless mask began to crack for a moment. Up until now, these two had met in this place before, but they never sparred. It was an unwritten law. There were no benefits to training together. No, there were benefits, but there were too many drawbacks. At present, in the kingdom, the nobles faction, comprising 3 of the 6 great noble families, and the king's faction were in a struggle for power. The country's straits were so dire that some believed the only thing holding everything together was the yearly war with the Empire. There was no way the king's right-hand man, Captain of the Royal Select, Gazov Stronov, could possibly lose. But supposing he did, the nobles faction opposing them would use it as ammunition to attack the king under the present circumstances. Likewise, if Climb lost, the nobles would probably take it as a chance to claim he couldn't be trusted to protect the princess. The fact that a common soldier of dubious pedigree had been appointed to guard the peerlessly beautiful and unwed princess rubbed many nobles the wrong way. And so, their respective positions would not forgive a loss. It was out of the question to show any weakness, expose a vital point, or allow openings that could be attacked. They both acted with the utmost prudence to avoid causing any trouble for their masters, a priority they shared due to their origins as commoners. What reason could Gazov have for breaking this rule? Climb looked around. It couldn't be simply that there wasn't anyone else there. The walls had eyes in this place. The chances were high that someone was observing them from afar or watching in the shadows, but he couldn't think of any other explanations. Unsure if it was a good reason or a bad one, Climb was confused and shaken, though he didn't let it show on his face. Before the boys stood the warrior said to be the strongest in the kingdom. Gazif keenly detected the split-second disturbance in Climb's emotions that normal humans would have naturally missed before he gave his response.
I was shown recently how green I still am. I'd like to train with someone who'll pose a bit of a challenge.
You. Green, sir?
Under what circumstances would Gazif learn he was still green? It was then that Climb remembered the unit he commanded had been missing members of late. Since Climb didn't have any close friends, he'd only heard the rumors bouncing around the mess hall. Apparently, the Royal Select had been caught up in something and lost a few men.
Yeah. If that charitable caster hadn't helped me, I probably wouldn't be here right now.
Hearing that, Climb felt his iron mask crumble. He couldn't help it. But who wouldn't be surprised? His curiosity got the better of him, and he asked.
A charitable caster?
His name was Ainz Ooal Gown. I'm not sure, but I think he's on the level of the Empire's monstrous casters.
It was not a name Climb had ever heard before. The young soldier admired heroes, and had a secret hobby of collecting sagas, regardless from what race the epic originated. Not only that, but he also collected as many exciting stories as he could from famous adventurers in the region. But he didn't recognize the name Gazif mentioned. Of course, there was always the possibility it was a pseudonym. Climb suppressed his desire to ask details.
I can't blithely ask about an incident that cost him some of his men. One could only be so rude. I'll commit that name to memory. So, is it really all right for you to train me?
I'm not training you. We're sparring. Whether you learn something from it or not is up to you. You're one of the best soldiers this country's got, you know. It'll be meaningful exercise for me, too.
That was high praise. But Climb considered nothing more than polite decorum. It wasn't as if Climb was remarkably strong. The standard he'd measured against was simply low. The kingdom soldiers were only marginally stronger than the average citizens, and weak compared to the Empire's knights, who were full-time. No member of this kingdom's army was famous enough to be known throughout the region. The men directly under Gazif were strong, certainly, but still not quite as strong as Climb. Out of the adventurer ranks of bronze, iron, silver, gold, platinum, mithril, orichalcum, and adamantite, Climb was probably gold. It wasn't as if he was weak, but there were always many more who were stronger. Could someone like him really engage in a sparring match worth the time of someone like Gazif, a warrior who was undoubtedly adamantite rank? Climb chased all the discouraging thoughts from his mind. It would be extremely valuable experience to learn from the strongest man in the kingdom. Even if he ended up disappointing Gazif, Climb would have no regrets.
Okay, then I'd like to go around, please.
Gazif grinned and nodded once with enthusiasm. They walked to the weapon rack together and equipped swords that were exactly the right size for them. Gazif chose a bastard sword, and Climb selected a small shield and a broadsword. Then, Climb took the lumps of metal out from his pockets. It would be rude to face someone stronger while still wearing them. Not to mention that if he didn't fight as hard as he could, he wouldn't grow. His opponent was the strongest warrior in the kingdom. Confronting this considerable challenge would require his all. Soon, Climb finished his preparations, and Gazif asked,
And, are your arms okay? They're not numb anymore?
No, sir. I'm fine now. They feel a bit warm, but there's no problem with my grip.
Climb waved his arms, and Gazif saw from the way they moved that the boy was telling the truth, and nodded.
Okay. But in a way, that's kind of too bad. You run into all kinds of situations on the battlefield, and can't always fight at your best. If your grip is weak, you need to adjust your style appropriately. Are you working on that?
No, I'm not. In that case, I'll do more practice swings.
Oh no, you don't have to go that far. But you're protecting the princess most of the time. It wouldn't be a waste to practice things like how to fight if you get attacked somewhere you're not allowed to carry a sword, and familiarize yourself with different weapons.
Yes, sir.
There are 9 basic disciplines of armed combat. Swords, shields, spears, axes, daggers, combat gauntlets, bows, bludgeons, and throwing weapons. If you try to learn too many, you'll end up neglecting all of them. I recommend narrowing it down to 2 or 3 and practicing those. Okay. Apologies for the boring commentary.
It wasn't boring, Captain Stronoff. Thank you. Gazov smiled awkwardly and waved off Climb's gratitude.
If you're ready, then let's get started. For now, come as you are. Later, well, I can't train you, but I'll give you some tips on fighting in the other disciplines.
Yes, sir. Looking forward to it.
Right. But know that it's not my intention for this to be a drill. Come at me like it's a real battle.
Climb slowly moved into a stance with his sword held low, facing Gazov with the left side of his body hidden behind the shield. His eyes were sharp, already treating this as more than practice. He could sense Gazov was also taking it seriously. They stared each other down, but Climb couldn't move. He was nimbler after removing the lumps of metal from his pockets. But Climb still didn't feel like he could beat Gazov. In both physical strength and experience, Gazov completely surpassed him. If he was careless in how he advanced, the captain would effortlessly intercept him. His opponent was superior, and there wasn't anything he could do about that. But if this were a real battle, would Climb simply lose his life because there was nothing to be done? So then what? He would have to meet Gazov with something Gazov didn't have. Climb lost out on strength, experience, and mental fortitude. Everything a warrior needed. If there was an exception, it would be in gear. Gazov had a bastard sword. Climb, however, had a broadsword and a small shield. If they were magical equipment, one blade could be superior to another. But these were made for training. In terms of weapons, he wasn't ahead. But whereas Gazov had only one, Climb had 2. A shield could be used defensively as well. In exchange for dividing his attack power, Climb had an advantage in versatility. He could deflect a blow with the shield and then swing the sword, or parry with the sword and strike with the shield. Climb observed Gazov's movements carefully, aiming for opportunities to counterattack. After a few seconds, the older man smiled slightly.
You're not going to charge? Then I'll start. Here I come.
Displaying absolute calm, Gazov held his sword aloft. He lowered his hips slightly, suffusing his frame with energy like a tense spring. Climb braced himself as well, so he'd be ready to defend whenever the sword was swung. Then, Gazov rushed forward and swung down at Climb's shield. He's fast! Climb gave up on maneuvering the shield to deflect the oncoming hit. He transferred all his attention and ability into the basic defensive act of withstanding the assault. In the next moment, a tremendous shock assailed his shield. Did it break from that one attack? It certainly felt like it, as the blow was so mighty it immobilized Climb's shield-bound hand. The strike was the kind that he had to block with his entire body. Deflect? How could I even match his speed like this? If I could at least get it to glance off smoothly. As Climb chided himself for being so naive, another shock assaulted his stomach. The young boy's body went flying. He landed hard on his back, and the stone floor knocked the wind out of him. One glance at Gazov was all it took to find out what happened. The older warrior retracted his leg after launching that heavy kick.
Don't pay too much attention to the sword just because it's all your opponent is carrying. You might get kicked like this. That time, I aimed for your stomach. But usually they'd go for a less guarded area. They'll try to shatter your knees, or, even if you got your groin padded, a kick from metal greaves can rupture things. You need to keep an eye on your opponent's entire form and watch their every move.
Yes, sir. Climb resisted the dull pain in his stomach and stood up. Gazov had tremendous physical strength. Kicking at full power, he could have easily broke Climb's ribs, Melchert or no, and rendered him unfit for combat. It was clear he hadn't kicked at full power, and had instead aimed his foot to send Climb flying and used no more strength than necessary.
So this is training after all. Thank you.
It was sinking in that this was a lesson from the kingdom's strongest warrior, and full of gratitude, Climb reassumed a fighting stance. How precious was this chance? He had to take care not to let it end too soon. Climb raised his shield again and inched forward. Gazif silently watched. If things continued like this, it would merely play out the same as last time. As Climb approached, he was forced to rethink his strategy. Climb sensed the overwhelming composure coming from the calmly waiting Gazif. He hadn't managed to draw out even a hint of his opponent's true strength. Being frustrated about his inability would probably be arrogant. Climb was already starting to reach his limits. Even though he always got up early to hone himself, his progress was slower than a snail's. Ever since he first picked up a sword, he had not improved fast enough. Even if he could condition his body to swing faster with heavier swords, he would probably still be unable to obtain specialized combat abilities. Surely it was rude to wish that Gazif, the embodiment of talent, would use his full abilities when Climb was so incapable. He lamented that his own skill wasn't enough to warrant them. Telling him to approach their bout as if it were a real battle and not practice had probably been Gazif's way of saying that if Climb didn't fight with the intent to kill, he wouldn't even be worth sparring with. Climb ground his teeth audibly with a crick sound. He hated how weak he was. If only he were stronger, he could be more useful. With more power, he would be the princess's weapon and face head-on those who sullied the kingdom, who caused the people to suffer. The princess had only one fragile sword, so she had to be careful when she wielded it, which racked Climb with guilt. But he immediately cleared those thoughts from his mind. What he needed now was to avoid drowning in negativity in this endeavor to enhance his abilities, even slightly, by clashing with everything he had against this man who stood at the heights of human potential. He had only one thought in his heart.
I want to be useful to the princess.
Oh,
Gazif murmured approvingly, his expression shifting slightly. It was because of the minute change he saw in the boy on the cusp of manhood in front of him. Up until a moment ago, Climb had been excited, like a child meeting a celebrity. But after the kick, that bubbly attitude had vanished and been replaced with the face of a warrior. Gazif raised his guard a notch. He thought more of Climb than the boy knew. He held an especially high opinion of that unwavering desire to better himself. His fervent devotion was akin to a religious faith, and then there was his swordsmanship. No one had taught Climb. He'd glean what he could by watching others train. His form was awkward and contained many extraneous movements. But unlike those who had unthinkingly studied exactly what they were taught, Climb considered the significance of each strike and cultivated a style that focused on real combat, or, to put it darkly, a killer style. Gazif thought it was absolutely wonderful. In the end, a sword was a tool for murder. Someone trained for sports and display wouldn't be effective in a serious battle. Such a style wouldn't protect or save anyone. But Climb was different. He would cut down his enemies and safeguard whatever was precious to him. However,
your attitude may have changed, but there's a clear gap between our ability levels. What are you gonna do about that?
To put it bluntly, Climb had no innate talent. Without that, he couldn't reach the heights of Gazif or Ainz Ooal Gown, no matter how much harder than everyone else he tried, regardless of how cruelly he tortured his flesh. Climb's attempts to be the strongest were nothing but a dream or a delusion. So, why was Gazif training Climb? Wouldn't it be more beneficial to spend his time on someone with more aptitude? The answer was simple. He couldn't stand around watching Climb expend pointless effort. If humans had a limit to their potential, then this boy was single-mindedly throwing himself at that wall over and over, and Gazif pitied him for it. He wanted to show Climb another way. It was his belief that even if there was a limit to ability, there was no limit to experience. The other reason was that Gazif regretted his greatest opponent's appalling state.
It's like I'm doing this to make up for that, which isn't fair to Climb, but still, it's not like he loses anything from going at it with me for a round. Come on, Climb!
A response with the spirit to break through Gazif's internal monologue came back to him. Sir! At the same time he replied, Climb dashed forward. Unlike before, Gazif slowly lifted his sword with a serious face. Then he brought it down from up high. If Climb received it with a shield, his approach would be halted completely. If he blocked it with a sword, he'd be repelled. It was an attack that rendered defense purposeless. It was a bad idea to defend, but Climb had a broadsword whereas Gazif had a bastard sword. Climb's weapon was shorter. All he could do was leap. Gazif knew that, so he was waiting to intercept. It was like entering a tiger's den, but the young soldier hesitated only for a moment. Climb came within range of Gazif's sword. Gazif's swing was perfectly timed, and Climb braced against it with a shield. The tremendous shock was even more intense this time. Pain ran up Climb's arm and made him grimace.
Too bad it ended up playing out the same as before.
Gazif seemed slightly disappointed as he aimed his foot at Climb's stomach. But then... Fortress! The moment Climb shouted, Gazif's face registered slight surprise. It wasn't as if the martial art fortress couldn't be used without a sword or shield. It was quite possible with either a hand or armor. The reason it was commonly activated when defending with a sword or shield was due to how tight the timing needed to be. One false move when using it with armor could end with the warrior suffering the hit unprotected. So, according to human psychology, most would want to activate it when blocking with something. But Climb knew when Gazif's kick would come, which solved the timing problem.
You meant for that to happen?
Yes, sir! The power in Gazif's kick vanished, as if something soft had absorbed it. His leg extended fully, and unable to drive any strength into it, he gave up and began to bring it back down. While Gazif was in this disadvantaged posture, Climb moved in to take a shot. Slash! Climb activated the martial art as he brought his sword down from high above. Create a single move that you can unleash with confidence. He possessed no inborn talent, but he'd taken to heart the advice a warrior had once given him, and desperately polished his overhead attack. Climb's body was not covered in an ostentatious layer of muscles, nor was he blessed with a physique that easily put on muscle in the first place. It wasn't as if he had the agility to put extra bulk to good use anyhow. So, he had toned his body and achieved a specialized build through what had seemed like infinite repetition. The result was his downward swing from up high, his singular strike achieving a speed that could be considered extraordinary, which practically summoned a gale in its wake. That was what failed toward Gazif's head. The idea that if his attack connected it could be fatal did not occur to Climb. He'd unleashed his move with absolute conviction that a man of Gazif's caliber wouldn't die from something like this. A sharp clang rang out as the bastard sword rose to meet the descending broadsword. Gazif had anticipated even this far ahead. Climb used all the energy in his body to try and throw the older warrior off balance, but Gazif's body didn't budge. Even in an unsteady position on one foot, Gazif had no problem stopping a blow bearing the entirety of Climb's might. The man was like a great tree, with thick roots deeply seated in the earth. Climb had used his martial art and all his strength. Even with those two things combined, he couldn't match one-footed Gazif. He was surprised to realize this, and then looked to his stomach. Slicing with the broadsword had meant closing the distance, and thus it was possible for Gazif to kick him again. He jumped away right as it arrived. Just a little dull pain. Then the two of them stared each other down a few paces apart. Gazif's eyes were happy, and his mouth curled in a grin. His expression was amused, but it contained no ill will. It was only a refreshing smile. It made Climb fidget, how Gazif beamed at him like a father proud of his son's improvement.
Nice work. I'm gonna take this next one a little bit seriously.
Gaziv's expression changed. Fear coursed through Climb's entire body. The kingdom's strongest warrior had finally shown himself.
I actually have one potion. If you end up with a broken bone or something, we can fix it up, so don't worry.
Thank you.
Hearing Gaziv basically announce, "I'm gonna break one of your bones, that's all," made Climb's heart pound. He was accustomed to injuries, but that didn't mean he liked them. Gaziv charged, twice as fast as Climb's previous approach. The bastard sword traced an extremely low arc aimed at Climb's feet, its tip practically scraping the ground. Flustered by the speed and centrifugal force, Climb protected his feet by gripping his broadsword blade down, as if to stick it into the floor. The two crashed together. That's what Climb thought. But suddenly, Gaziv's bastard sword rose back up, slicing along the edge of the broadsword. Climb turned his entire body and face away from the bastard sword, which missed him by a tiny margin. The draft blew a few of his hairs away. Climb was terrified by how quickly Gaziv had been able to corner him. He followed the bastard sword with only his eyes, but saw it suddenly stop sharp and come back around. Faster than he could think. His survival instinct seemed to drive him to thrust his shield forward, when the bastard sword crashed into it with a shrill clang. And then, with a sharp pain, Climb's body sailed sideways. When he fell to the floor, the shock knocked the weapon out of his hands. The bastard sword had rebounded off the shield to the side, delivering a heavy impact at Climb's wide-open flank.
Flow! Don't think. First attack, then defend. You have to move in a way that connects you to your next stroke. Defending is but another part of the attack.
As Climb retrieved his fallen sword and made to get up while holding to his side, Gaziv gently spoke to him, saying,
I held back so nothing would break. You're still good, right? What do you want to do?
In contrast to Gaziv, who didn't seem the least out of breath, Climb was panting from the pain and stress. If he couldn't last for more than a few exchanges like this, he was wasting Gaziv's time. But he still wanted to improve, even if only slightly. He nodded at Gaziv and held up his sword.
Okay, then let's keep going.
Yes, sir! With a hoarse voice, Climb raced forward. After being struck, launched away, and occasionally kicked or punched, Climb collapsed on the floor, out of breath. The cold stones leached the heat out of him through his mail and clothing, which felt good. Panting, he didn't even move to wipe the sweat off his face. Rather, he didn't have the energy to. Enduring the pain welling up in various locations, Climb was overwhelmed by the fatigue coursing through his entire body, and he lightly closed his eyes.
Good work. I tried to swing so you wouldn't get any breaks or fractures. But how are you feeling?
Still lying on the floor, Climb moved his arms, examining the painful spots before opening his eyes.
There doesn't seem to be anything wrong. I'm hurting, but it should only be bruises.
The throbbing aches he felt were far from serious. They wouldn't prevent him from guarding the princess.
Okay. Then you don't need the potion, huh?
No, because if I overuse them, I won't get any of the benefits of strength training.
Letting your muscles heal naturally makes them stronger. But if you use magic to restore them to their original state, then that doesn't happen. I getcha. Are you off to be bodyguard for the princess now?
Yes.
Then I'll give it to you. Use it if you have any problems.
He placed the potion next to Climb with a clink.
Thank you.
Climb sat up and regarded the man his sword had been unable to approach even once. The unscathed warrior asked in puzzlement.
What?
Nah, I was thinking that you're amazing.
Gaziv had barely any sweat on his forehead. He wasn't out of breath. Sighing, Climb acknowledged the gap between the strongest man in the kingdom and himself. A boy splayed out on the floor. In response, Gazov grinned awkwardly.
Oh, I see.
How?
I can't really answer the question of how I got this strong. I just had some inborn talent, that's all. By the way, I learned how to fight during my mercenary days. The nobles are always screaming about how vulgar my kicks are, but I learned those back then too.
There were no tricks to getting stronger. Gazov had declared it so. He denied with ease the small hope Climb had clung to, the belief that he might be able to grow more powerful if he continued his current training.
In that sense, it's a good style for you, Climb. Punching, kicking, a style where you can use your arms and legs like that.
You think so?
Yeah. Not being trained as a swordsman or soldier will work in your favor. People tend to focus on blade work once they have a sword in their hands. But I don't think that's very smart. In a real fight, a doctrine that fully utilizes the hands and feet with a sword as simply another offensive option should prove more useful. Well, it's kind of fighting dirty. But it works for adventurers.
Climb dropped his usual expressionless manner and smiled. He never thought the strongest man in the kingdom would hold such a high opinion of his sword skills or his inconsistent, unorthodox movements. Climb knew the noble scoffed at his style from the shadows, so praise like this was a big deal for him.
All right, I'm going to head out. I need to be ready for breakfast with the king. Are you okay on time?
Yes, the princess will have a visitor today.
A visitor? One of the nobles?
Gazov wondered who the princess would be entertaining, and Climb answered.
From the Ainz family.
Ainz. Oh, then which one? Blue, right? I can't imagine it'd be the red one.
Yes, from the Blue Roses.
Gazov was visibly relieved.
Aha, I see. So her friend is coming.
Gazov seemed to guess that Rainier didn't want Climb at breakfast with her friend, but Climb had actually declined an invitation. Even if he had the kind of relationship with her that allowed it, refusing an offer from one of the royal family would definitely have made Gazov frown. So Climb said nothing and left the details up to the older man's imagination. As for Ainz herself, she was also acquainted with Climb through Rainier and was friendly with him. She wouldn't react badly like the other nobles if he came to breakfast. But Rainier had few female friends, and he figured she could get more of that rare girl talk without a guy around.
Thank you for today, Captain Gazov.
No, don't worry about it. I had fun too.
If you don't mind, could you train me again sometime?
Gazov wasn't sure what to say, but faster than Climb could notice and apologize, the captain responded.
Sure, as long as we can find a time and place where no one else is around.
Climb knew what the conflict had been, so he didn't say anything awkward. He flexed his creaking muscles and stood up. He did, however, express his honest thoughts.
Thank you.
Gazov gave a benevolent wave and got moving.
Okay, let's clean up. There'll be trouble if I don't make it to breakfast on time. Oh, and that swing from overhead is pretty good. You just need to think about how to follow up, in case your opponent dodges or blocks it.
Yes, sir!
4. Third late fire moon. September, 6:22 a.m. After leaving Gazov and wiping himself down with a damp towel, Climb went to a place very different from the large practice hall. This room was as spacious as the training area he'd come from. Many people sat at benches, chatting. An appetizing scent suffused the warm atmosphere. It was the mess hall. Cutting across the room, weaving through the noise, Climb joined the line behind a few others. Following the people in front of him, Climb took dishes from the arranged stacks. On his tray, he placed a wooden plate and a wooden stew bowl. Then, a wooden cup. Everyone received their food in order. A large steamed potato, brown bread, a white stew with a decent helping of fixings, pickled cabbage, a sausage. From Climb's perspective, it was a luxurious meal. The array of all those things on his tray gave off inviting smells. Suddenly feeling hungry, Climb looked out across the mess hall. The soldiers ate with no small commotion, making idle chat with their neighbors about what they would do on their next day off, the food, their families, mundane stories about their work, and so on. Climb spotted an empty seat and made his way through the busy room. He straddled the bench and sat down. There were soldiers on either side of him, having nice chats with their friends. As Climb sat down, the ones nearest him spared him just a glance, before looking away in apparent disinterest. It was like there was a lull that surrounded only Climb. From the outside, it seemed odd. Lively conversations went on all around Climb, but not a single person called out to him. Certainly not many people would randomly talk to a stranger, but considering they were soldiers serving at the same place and trusting their lives to one another when on duty, this treatment was a bit strange. It was like he didn't exist. Climb didn't make an effort to talk to anyone either. He knew where he stood. The guardians of Rolente Castle were not ordinary military. The kingdom's soldiers included levies outfitted by landed nobility. Soldiers who were like a private army whose wages were paid by city officials, and the guards who mainly patrolled the city. They all shared one thing: their commoner backgrounds. But there were various problems with entrusting peasants of unknown origin with the castle's protection, and bringing them so close to the royal family and all the kingdom's sensitive intelligence. Accordingly, the soldiers who guarded Rolente Castle needed a recommendation from a noble. If a soldier caused any issues, the vouching noble would be held responsible, so the candidates were necessarily of clearly established identity with no evidence of problems with their thoughts or behavior. But something had developed as a result of this system. Factions. The nobles who supplied castle guard nominees all belonged to one or another of them. Naturally, the soldiers aligned themselves with the affiliations of their patrons. Those who would defy their noble would never be elected in the first place, so it wasn't an exaggeration to say there was virtually no soldiers who eschewed factionalism. At first glance, this setup appeared to be wholly detrimental, but if there were an advantage to speak of, it was that because conflict between factions could potentially spark a war, the soldiers were expected to apply themselves diligently. Even if they still couldn't match up to the Empire's knights, the soldiers who guarded the castle were fairly skilled. Of course, Climb was a few notches above them, and that was another reason the nobles resented him. He was stronger than the soldiers they backed. It was possible to conceive of a sponsoring noble who didn't belong to a faction, but in the current power struggle between the king's faction and the nobles, there was only a single noble who was skilled enough to strategically flip back and forth like a bat between them. And among the soldiers, there was only one who had not joined up with either faction besides the troops endorsed by that exceptional noble. That was Climb. Climb's position was a very difficult one. Normally, someone of Climb's background wouldn't be able to serve as Renaer's personal attendant. The role of protecting a member of the royal family would normally never be an option for a low-born citizen. It was generally accepted that the only ones fit to protect the royal family were of noble rank. But there was the exception of Gazif Stronov, the strongest soldier in the kingdom, and his elite men. That, and more importantly, there weren't many who could openly oppose Princess Renaer if she strongly desired something. Maybe a relative could speak frankly with her, but if the king approved, no one could dissent. The reason Climb had a private room was due to this difficult position. If he were an ordinary soldier, he would have shared a big common room instead. Although Renaer's authoritative pronouncement was part of the reason he had his own room, the other part was to isolate him. They didn't know where to place him because he didn't belong to a faction. He was a problem. Considering Climb's own circumstances and his position, he would naturally belong to the king's faction. But the king's faction was comprised mainly of nobles who swore loyalty to the king. Climb was a nobody whose existence the nobles would undoubtedly frown upon. So, the group wouldn't know how to treat him if they took him in, and he would naturally cooperate with them if they left him alone. Whereas for the nobles, it would be quite a prize to win Climb over, but it would also be dangerous. Still, each faction contained countless nobles. It wasn't as if their thoughts and opinions were monolithic. In the end, a faction was no more than a gathering of similarly minded people who desired the advantage of banding together. So of course, there were some in the king's faction who detested Climb, the beautiful golden princess's closest aide despite his uncertain peasant background, and some in the opposing noble's faction who wanted to befriend him. In any case, no one thus far had been so imprudent as to cause schisms in their faction over one guy. The result was that although everyone wanted to avoid his going to the other side, they didn't want to go so far as to have him on theirs. That's why no one talked to him, why he dined alone. He ate his meal without chatting with anyone and looked to neither side. He finished his breakfast in less than 10 minutes.
Okay, guess I should get going.
Satisfied, he talked to himself under his breath, a growing habit from being alone so much. As he stood up, and a soldier who happened to be passing by bumped into him. The man's elbow jabbed a spot he'd hurt training with Gazif that morning, and although his face remained expressionless, he stopped short from the pain. The soldier who'd bumped into him kept walking without saying a thing. Naturally, none of the surrounding soldiers spoke up either. Some of the ones who had witnessed what happened furrowed their brows a tiny bit. But still, no one moved to say something. Climb exhaled slowly and walked off with his empty dishes. This degree of harassment was all too common. He was just glad it hadn't happened when there was hot stew in his bowl. Someone would stick a leg out and trip him. Someone would bump into him, pretending it was an accident. These things happened all the time. Still,
What about it?
Climb walked on, unconcerned. They couldn't do anything more than that either, especially in a place like the mess hall where there were so many people watching. Climb kept his chest out. He kept his eyes facing forward and his head high. If he did anything shameful, it would cause trouble for his master, Renair. The reputation of the woman he devoted his whole self to was on the line.